The story begins in the shadows of Australia's industrial awakening, during an era when poverty wore 1,000 faces and death arrived without warning in cramped tenements where families fought daily battles against hunger and disease. This narrative unfolds across two colonies, moving from the maritime chaos of South Australia to the grimy industrial heart of Melbourne, revealing a sequence of events so chilling that they would later be remembered as among the darkest in colonial criminal history. In the 1860s, a child named Martha entered the world in Port Adelaide, a bustling harbour district where ships disgorged their cargo and their human freight onto docks slick with salt and commerce. The neighborhood pulsed with the rhythms of working-class existence, where laborers crowded into insufficient housing and wages fluctuated with the tides of economic fortune. Medical ignorance reigned supreme in those years, transforming every fever into a potential death sentence and every injury into a crisis that might shatter a family's fragile stability. The girl's early years unfolded against a backdrop of relentless economic pressure. When the 1880s collapsed into the 90s, Australia's working populations found themselves crushed beneath waves of unemployment and food scarcity. The land speculation bubble that had drawn thousands into the cities burst spectacularly, leaving families stranded in overcrowded districts like Richmond, where women bore the crushing weight of household survival with little help and less hope. Martha's childhood offered no sanctuary from these harsh realities. Her father, Joseph Henry, departed from life while she remained small, leaving her mother Mary to navigate widowhood in a society that showed little mercy to women alone. Mary eventually remarried, taking Daniel Foran as her new husband, and the reconstituted family squeezed itself into a tiny two-room structure in North Adelaide where privacy became an impossible luxury and every day demanded exhausting physical labor simply to maintain existence. Losing a father in 19th-century South Australia meant that daughters inherited responsibilities far beyond their years. Martha found herself trapped in an endless cycle of household chores, minding younger siblings, and submitting to discipline that frequently crossed into brutality. Her mother wielded sticks and rope as instruments of correction, while her stepfather's misconduct created additional burdens that no child should bear. When Mary gave birth to two more children from her second marriage, the pressure within those cramped walls intensified to unbearable levels. The family's meager income left no room for comfort or relief. Social protection simply did not exist for children trapped in such circumstances, and escape routes remained permanently closed to those without means or connections. By the time Martha reached her 13th year, the household expelled her into domestic service, a transition that countless working-class girls experienced as their inevitable fate. For families teetering on the edge of starvation, this separation represented not cruelty but survival mathematics, a cold calculation that divided families with surgical precision and little expectation of reunion. Martha's independence began not through choice but through the grinding necessity that shaped every aspect of working-class life in colonial Australia. The 1880s brought marriage for Martha when she joined herself to Henry Needle, a carpenter whose trade offered the promise of modest but reliable income. Their early years together suggested nothing remarkable, just another working family navigating the precarious balance between survival and disaster. They moved through a series of rented rooms while Henry secured employment, and their household achieved the unremarkable stability that represented success for families of their class. 3 daughters arrived in succession during these years, Mabel first, then Elsie, followed by May, and neighbors occasionally spotted the family moving through Richmond streets, a scene of apparent domestic normalcy. Time, however, revealed cracks in this facade of orderly family life. Henry's temperament began shifting toward volatility, and jealousy transformed him into a source of constant disruption. Arguments erupted with increasing frequency, loud enough that neighbors could hear raised voices through thin walls. On multiple occasions, observers witnessed Henry storming from the house in fury while Martha remained inside attempting to calm frightened children. These public disturbances marked a clear departure from the family's earlier appearance of stability and signaled growing dysfunction within the household. On the 23rd of February in 1885, tragedy struck when Mabel, the eldest daughter, succumbed to an illness that medical practitioners could neither explain nor halt. The child weakened steadily over a brief period, her decline observed by attending doctors who documented symptoms without achieving diagnosis. After death claimed the girl, Martha navigated the administrative requirements associated with Mabel's insurance policy, collecting a payment that represented standard practice among families who could ill afford burial expenses without such financial protection. The years following Mabel's death brought escalating misfortune to the Needle household. Henry's health deteriorated in ways that puzzled those who knew him. Co-workers noticed him returning early from carpentry jobs, observed him sitting motionless on the veranda for extended periods, and watched him push away meals barely touched. On the 4th of October in 1889, death arrived for Henry after a brief illness that doctors examined without reaching definitive conclusions about its cause. Following his death, Martha processed the insurance claim connected to his policy and received £200, a substantial sum that represented years of ordinary wages. Soon after Henry's passing, the second daughter Elsie began exhibiting signs of decline. Neighbors recalled seeing her playing outside just days before she took to her bed permanently. Her condition worsened with relentless consistency despite medical attention, and death claimed her in 1890. The insurance policy held for Elsie yielded approximately £60, which Martha collected through routine administrative channels. Following the deaths that had emptied her household, Martha secured employment with a family of brothers engaged in the saddlery trade. Otto, Louis, and Herman Juncan maintained business operations that frequently required travel between Richmond and Adelaide, and they needed someone to manage their domestic arrangements. Martha assumed responsibility for maintaining their lodgings, preparing meals, and handling various household tasks that their commercial activities left them insufficient time to address. Her competence in these duties initially seemed beyond question, and as months passed, her connection to the family deepened beyond mere employment. Otto Juncan and Martha developed an attachment that progressed toward formal engagement. The prospect of this union, however, failed to generate unanimous approval within the Juncan family. Louis and Herman observed certain irregularities in Martha's behavior that troubled them sufficiently to voice concerns about the proposed marriage. They noticed meals abandoned on the stove without explanation, instructions that seemed to pass through her awareness without registration, and prolonged silences during which she appeared mentally absent from her surroundings. These observations accumulated over time, creating growing unease about Otto's intentions. Louis proved particularly vocal in his opposition to the match. He made repeated attempts to dissuade his brother from proceeding with the engagement, pointing to incidents that suggested instability beneath Martha's outwardly capable exterior. Herman shared these reservations, though he expressed them more cautiously, reluctant to create open conflict within the family. The tension surrounding this matter became apparent to acquaintances and business associates who interacted with the brothers during this period. Despite these warnings, Otto remained committed to his plans, dismissing his brother's concerns as excessive caution born from natural protectiveness. The domestic routine appeared to function normally through the closing months of 1893 and into the early weeks of 1894. Martha continued managing the household with apparent efficiency while Otto's brothers maintained their reservations in relative silence. Then circumstances shifted dramatically when Louis traveled to Richmond to visit Otto at the beginning of 1894. During this stay, Louis took his meals at the lodging where Martha oversaw all food preparation and service. One morning Louis rose earlier than usual and stepped outside briefly, exchanging a few words with someone passing along the street. He returned indoors within minutes, and sounds from the kitchen indicated that the morning meal was being prepared. By midday, however, Louis began complaining of sudden physical discomfort. Otto discovered him seated at the table, leaning heavily against the chair back, unable to continue eating the food placed before him. Within a short time, the discomfort escalated into severe pain accompanied by violent vomiting. As Louis's condition rapidly deteriorated, Otto dispatched someone to fetch medical assistance. The doctor who responded found Louis confined to bed, unable to rise without support, his face contorted with pain. The physician remained at the bedside throughout the afternoon, administering whatever remedies his medical knowledge suggested, but relief proved temporary and the suffering continued unabated into the evening hours. As darkness fell, Louis's condition worsened further. By the time morning approached again, death had claimed him, leaving his brothers and Martha to make arrangements for his body. The deceased was transported to South Australia for burial at Lyndoch, following family tradition. Otto traveled to attend the funeral services, leaving Martha behind in Richmond to maintain the household during his absence. The death of Louis occurred with sufficient suddenness that questions might reasonably have been raised about its cause, yet the medical practitioner who attended him certified the death without expressing particular suspicion. In an era when sudden illness frequently proved fatal and diagnostic capabilities remained primitive, the tragedy appeared unfortunate but not necessarily mysterious. When Otto returned from the funeral, business matters required Herman's presence in Melbourne. He arrived to settle affairs connected with Louis's estate and personal effects, and as his brother had done, Herman took meals at the lodging where Martha prepared the food. Shortly after his arrival, Herman began experiencing episodes of severe illness that bore disturbing similarities to what had afflicted Louis. The first attack struck Herman soon after a meal. Otto found him seated near the small table in the front room, hands pressed against his abdomen, his face pale and drawn. Herman vomited repeatedly, complaining of intense pain that seemed to radiate through his entire torso. The symptoms persisted for several hours before gradually subsiding, leaving him weak and shaken. Herman attributed the episode to something disagreeable in the food or perhaps contaminated water, a common enough occurrence in urban areas where sanitation remained inadequate. The following day brought a recurrence of the symptoms. Herman had attempted to continue his business activities in the city but was forced to return to the lodging prematurely, appearing unsteady and ill as he entered. Otto helped him to bed while Martha prepared tea and opened windows to improve air circulation in the room. The illness again manifested with violent vomiting and severe abdominal pain, and Herman's condition appeared serious enough that Otto considered summoning medical help. A doctor named Boyd eventually examined Herman after multiple episodes of illness had occurred. The physician's suspicions were aroused by the pattern of symptoms and their timing in relation to meals. Dr. Boyd obtained samples of Herman's vomit and arranged for chemical analysis, a procedure that remained relatively uncommon but was gaining acceptance as forensic science slowly advanced. The results of this analysis revealed the presence of arsenic in quantities sufficient to cause the observed symptoms. Armed with this information, Dr. Boyd advised Herman to avoid consuming anything prepared within the household and recommended that authorities be notified. The situation had transformed from a medical matter into a potential criminal investigation. Herman's survival depended upon his avoiding further poisoning, while evidence needed to be secured before the responsible party could destroy it or flee. On the 13th of June in 1894, detectives arrived at the Richmond lodging while Martha remained unaware that her activities had come under official scrutiny. The plan devised by law enforcement involved careful observation rather than immediate confrontation. Herman had been instructed to act normally while authorities monitored the household, waiting for evidence that would prove beyond doubt that poisoning was occurring deliberately rather than through accidental contamination. That afternoon, Martha prepared tea for Herman according to her usual routine. The detectives, positioned where they could observe without being seen, watched as she handled the preparation. Herman received the cup but did not drink from it, instead managing to preserve its contents for examination. When the tea was later subjected to chemical analysis, it revealed arsenic in lethal concentration, mixed into the liquid with clear intent to cause harm or death. This discovery provided authorities with the concrete evidence necessary to proceed with arrest. Officers entered the lodging and took Martha into custody while conducting a thorough search of the premises. They discovered a tin of rat poison bearing the commercial name Rough on Rats, a product widely available for household pest control but also notorious as a source of arsenic used in criminal poisonings. Additional items associated with food preparation were collected as potential evidence. Statements were formally recorded from Herman and Otto concerning the illnesses both brothers had experienced, the circumstances surrounding Louis's death, and the household arrangements that had given Martha access to their meals. Dr. Boyd provided written documentation of his medical findings, the symptoms he had observed in Herman, and the laboratory results confirming arsenic poisoning. The initial evidence assembled by investigators appeared substantial, but the true scope of Martha's alleged crimes remained to be discovered. The quantity of arsenic found in Herman's intercepted tea, combined with the presence of rat poison in the lodging and the pattern of illness following meals Martha had prepared, convinced authorities that a broader investigation was warranted. The deaths that had occurred within Martha's immediate family suddenly appeared in a sinister new light. What had previously been accepted as tragic but natural losses now demanded forensic examination. Officials ordered the exhumation of Louis Junkin's remains from the burial ground at Lyndoch in South Australia. Simultaneously, they commanded that the bodies of Henry Needle and his 3 daughters, Mabel, Elsie, and May, be removed from their grave at the cemetery where Martha had constructed the elaborate memorial. These exhumations proceeded under careful supervision, with proper documentation maintained throughout the process to ensure the integrity of any evidence obtained. Tissue samples and organ specimens from each body were extracted and submitted to analysts trained in detecting metallic poisons. The procedures required meticulous care, as contamination or improper handling could compromise results and undermine any subsequent legal proceedings. The chemists worked methodically, applying tests designed to reveal even small quantities of arsenic that might have persisted in decomposed remains. When the analytical results returned, they confirmed the presence of arsenic in every body examined. In several cases, the quantities detected were sufficient to have caused death, even accounting for the passage of time since burial. The findings were compiled into formal reports and presented to Crown prosecutors, who now possessed evidence suggesting a pattern of deliberate poisoning spanning nearly a decade and claiming at least 5 lives. The investigation expanded to trace the source of the poison. A shopkeeper came forward after being contacted by police, stating that Martha had purchased rat poison from his establishment on at least one occasion. He recalled her explanation that the product was needed to address a vermin problem, a claim that seemed unremarkable at the time given the common use of such poisons in households throughout the city. The shopkeeper identified the brand as Rough on Rats and confirmed that the tin found in Martha's lodging matched the type he had supplied to her. Additional witnesses were located who could testify to various aspects of Martha's domestic arrangements and the sequence of deaths that had occurred over the years. Neighbors recalled the succession of funerals, the visible grief Martha had displayed, and her frequent visits to the cemetery to oversee work on the family grave. None had suspected anything sinister at the time, viewing Martha as a devoted wife and mother struck by extraordinary misfortune. The accumulation of evidence, forensic findings from exhumed bodies, chemical analysis of the intercepted tea, the presence of rat poison in Martha's possession, witness testimony regarding purchases and patterns of illness, and the insurance payments following each death, created what prosecutors believed to be an overwhelming case. The circumstantial connections between Martha's presence, access to food preparation, and subsequent deaths or illnesses formed a pattern too consistent to be coincidental. Formal charges of murder were filed against Martha Needle. The legal proceedings would focus initially on a single count to establish guilt, though prosecutors possessed evidence relating to multiple deaths. The selection of which murder to charge first involved strategic considerations about which case presented the strongest evidence and most straightforward narrative for a jury to follow. The authorities chose to proceed with a charge related to one of the more recent deaths where forensic evidence was most conclusive and witness testimony most detailed. The trial would test not only the specific evidence in that case but also whether the broader pattern of deaths could be presented to demonstrate consistent criminal methodology. The legal battle ahead would determine whether Martha would face execution or whether reasonable doubt could be established regarding her guilt. The trial commenced on the 3rd of October in 1894 within the imposing chambers of Melbourne's Supreme Court. The courtroom filled rapidly as public curiosity drew crowds eager to witness proceedings in a case that had already generated considerable discussion throughout the city. The gallery seats were occupied well before the scheduled start time, with additional observers filling every available space along the walls. The atmosphere carried that peculiar tension that accompanies cases involving multiple deaths and accusations against someone who had lived among the community as an ordinary person. Martha entered the dock displaying remarkable composure considering the severity of charges against her and the potential consequences of conviction. She wore dark clothing appropriate to her status as a widow, her face showing little emotion as officials arranged documents and witnesses assembled in designated areas. The judge took his position, legal representatives for both Crown and defense prepared their materials, and the formal machinery of justice began its methodical process. The prosecution opened by outlining a narrative of systematic poisoning extending across years and claiming multiple victims who had all shared one common factor: complete dependence upon Martha for their meals and daily care. The Crown's case would rest primarily upon forensic evidence demonstrating arsenic presence in exhumed bodies, chemical analysis of seized materials, witness testimony regarding patterns of illness, and circumstantial evidence connecting Martha to poison purchases and insurance payments following deaths. Otto Juncan was called early in the proceedings to establish the relationship between Martha and his family, the engagement that had prompted opposition from his brothers, and the specific circumstances surrounding both Louis's death and Herman's subsequent illnesses. Otto's testimony proved painful for him to deliver, as he was required to describe in detail events that had transformed his intended bride into a defendant accused of murdering his brother and attempting to kill another. He recounted Louis's arrival in Richmond, the sudden onset of illness following a meal, the rapid deterioration despite medical attention, and the death that had occurred with shocking speed. Otto described returning from Louis's funeral only to have Hermann arrive shortly thereafter and begin experiencing similar symptoms. His testimony established the timeline of events and Martha's consistent presence preparing food that preceded each episode of illness. Hermann Juncan followed his brother to the witness stand, providing his own account of the illnesses that had nearly killed him. He described the severe abdominal pain, the violent vomiting, and the weakness that had left him barely able to stand. Hermann testified about Dr. Boyd's examination, the collection of samples for analysis, and the subsequent discovery of arsenic poisoning. His testimony was particularly significant because he had survived, providing living evidence of attempted murder where other victims could speak only through forensic examination of their remains. Dr. Boyd's testimony carried substantial weight as expert medical evidence. He detailed his examination of Hermann, the symptoms that had aroused his professional suspicions, and his decision to preserve samples for chemical analysis. The doctor explained how the pattern of symptoms, severe gastrointestinal distress, vomiting, abdominal pain, and weakness, aligned with classic presentations of acute arsenic poisoning. He described the procedures used to obtain and preserve evidence, ensuring the chain of custody remained unbroken and results remained reliable. The chemist who had performed analyses on multiple samples took the stand to present his findings. He explained the testing procedures used to detect and quantify arsenic, the precautions taken to avoid contamination, and the certainty with which he could state that arsenic was present in Hermann's vomit, the intercepted tea, and the tissue samples from 5 exhumed bodies. His testimony translated complex chemical processes into language the jury could understand while maintaining the scientific precision necessary to withstand cross-examination. The presentation of results from the exhumations proved particularly devastating to any potential defense. The chemist methodically detailed findings from each body: Henry Needle, Mabel Needle, Elsie Needle, May Needle, and Louis Juncan. In every case, arsenic was detected in quantities that could not be explained through environmental contamination or post-mortem absorption from soil. The levels found were consistent with deliberate administration of poison in doses intended to cause death. The shopkeeper who had sold rat poison to Martha provided testimony that established her access to arsenic. He described her visit to his establishment, her stated need for poison to control vermin, and his sale of Rough on Rats, a commercial product containing arsenic in lethal concentrations. The tin discovered in Martha's lodging matched the brand he had supplied, creating a direct link between her and the poison found in victims and in the intercepted tea. Supporting witnesses testified to various aspects of the case that, while individually minor, collectively reinforced the prosecution's narrative. Neighbors described the succession of deaths in Martha's household, her visible mourning, and the elaborate grave she had commissioned. Others recalled seeing Martha traveling frequently to the cemetery, consulting with stonemasons, and overseeing construction of the memorial that had consumed much of the insurance money. None of these witnesses could testify to witnessing actual poisoning, but their accounts established patterns of behavior and circumstances that the prosecution argued were consistent with calculated murder. The Crown prosecutor, in addressing the jury, emphasized the cumulative weight of evidence rather than relying on any single piece. He pointed to the recurring presence of arsenic in bodies removed from 2 separate burial grounds, the poison found in Martha's possession, the arsenic detected in tea intended for Hermann, and the consistent pattern wherein illness and death followed consumption of food or drink prepared under Martha's supervision. He argued that while each element might theoretically be explained independently, the combination created an undeniable picture of systematic poisoning. The prosecutor further challenged the jury to consider what alternative explanation could possibly account for the evidence before them. He asked them to contemplate the improbability that 5 individuals under Martha's care would all die from illnesses containing the same poison, that this poison would coincidentally be the same substance found in her possession, and that survivors would recover only after being warned to avoid food she prepared. The mathematical improbability of such coincidences occurring naturally, he argued, exceeded any reasonable standard of doubt. He directed particular attention to the insurance policies that had paid out following each death. While insurance itself was not criminal and many working families maintained such policies as prudent financial planning, the pattern demanded scrutiny. Martha had received payments after her husband died, after each of her 3 daughters died, and would presumably have benefited had Herman and Otto also perished. The money provided motive, though the prosecutor was careful to note that motive alone proved nothing. It merely supplied a rational explanation for otherwise inexplicable actions. The defense faced an extraordinarily difficult position. Martha had declined to testify in her own defense, a right accorded to defendants but one that prevented her from offering any alternative narrative or explanation for the damning evidence. Her legal representative could cross-examine prosecution witnesses and attempt to cast doubt on their testimony, but without the defendant providing her version of events, the defense remained purely reactive rather than presenting an affirmative case. No defense witnesses were called to testify on Martha's behalf. No character witnesses came forward to speak of her kindness or reliability. No alternative explanations were offered for how arsenic came to be in 5 bodies, in the intercepted tea, and in her lodging. No testimony challenged the chemical findings or suggested contamination or laboratory error. The defense strategy, such as it was, consisted primarily of arguing that the prosecution had failed to meet its burden of proof and that circumstantial evidence, however abundant, remained circumstantial. During cross-examination of prosecution witnesses, the defense attorney attempted to highlight gaps and uncertainties. He questioned doctors about whether other substances might produce similar symptoms to arsenic poisoning. He pressed the chemist on the precision of his tests and whether environmental factors could have introduced arsenic into buried bodies. He challenged witnesses on the reliability of their memories regarding events that had occurred months or years earlier. These efforts produced minor admissions of theoretical possibility but failed to shake the fundamental testimony of any key witness. The defense faced the particular challenge that Herman Juncan remained alive and could testify directly about being poisoned. Unlike the earlier deaths where alternative medical explanations might theoretically be proposed, Herman's case involved arsenic detected in his vomit, his recovery after ceasing to consume food Martha prepared, and the arsenic found in tea she had made for him. The living victim eliminated much of the ambiguity that might otherwise have existed around the historical deaths. When the defense attorney addressed the jury in his closing argument, he appealed primarily to the principle that conviction required proof beyond reasonable doubt. He acknowledged the troubling nature of the evidence but urged jurors to consider whether absolute certainty of guilt existed. He suggested that the prosecution had presented a theory consistent with the evidence but had not necessarily proven that theory to be the only possible explanation. He emphasized that sending someone to their death required more than suspicion or probability, it demanded certainty that no reasonable person could question. The judge's instructions to the jury were thorough and carefully balanced. He explained the legal standards governing murder convictions, the burden of proof resting upon the prosecution, and the requirement that jurors find guilt beyond reasonable doubt before voting to convict. He reviewed the evidence presented by both sides, summarizing key testimony without expressing his own opinion on its credibility or weight. He reminded jurors that their verdict must be based solely on evidence presented in court rather than external information or personal feelings about the defendant. The jury retired to consider their verdict with the full weight of Martha's life resting upon their deliberations. In cases involving capital punishment, juries typically spent considerable time reviewing evidence and debating conclusions before reaching consensus. The complexity of this case, with its multiple victims, forensic evidence, and absence of eyewitnesses to actual poisoning, might reasonably have been expected to produce extended deliberation. Instead, the jury returned with remarkable speed. The brevity of their deliberation suggested either unanimous clarity about the evidence or perhaps the overwhelming cumulative weight of the prosecution's case left little room for genuine doubt. When the foreman delivered the verdict, his voice carried clearly through the hushed courtroom. The jury had found Martha Needle guilty of murder. The pronouncement transformed the proceeding from a trial seeking truth to a sentencing hearing where only one outcome was possible under the law. The judge addressed Martha directly, noting the severity of her crimes and the legal requirement that murder convictions carry the death penalty. He pronounced sentence with the formal language that centuries of legal tradition had established for such moments. Martha would be hanged by the neck until dead, and her body would be buried within the prison grounds following execution. Martha displayed no visible reaction to the sentence. She stood in the dock with the same composure she had maintained throughout the trial, her face revealing nothing of whatever thoughts or emotions might have moved beneath that impassive exterior. Guards led her from the courtroom to begin the brief interval between conviction and execution, a period during which condemned prisoners were housed under constant observation to prevent self-harm that might cheat the gallows. The verdict and sentence generated extensive discussion throughout Melbourne and beyond. Newspapers provided detailed accounts of the trial, the evidence presented, and the swiftness with which the jury had reached its conclusion. Public opinion divided between those who viewed the conviction as justice appropriately served and those who questioned whether a woman could truly be capable of such systematic murder of her own family. The latter group did not necessarily doubt her guilt but rather struggled to reconcile the enormity of the crimes with prevailing assumptions about feminine nature and maternal instinct. Otto Juncan found himself trapped in an agonizing position following the verdict. The woman he had intended to marry stood convicted of murdering his brother and attempting to kill another. Yet despite the overwhelming evidence and the jury's decisive verdict, Otto could not entirely sever his emotional attachment to Martha. He began making regular visits to the jail during the hours when condemned prisoners were permitted to receive visitors, a practice that puzzled and disturbed many who knew of his connection to the case. These visits occurred with sufficient frequency that jail staff came to recognize Otto as a regular presence. He brought small packages containing clothing items and writing materials, which guards examined before permitting them to be delivered to the prisoner. The regulations governing condemned prisoners were strict but not entirely devoid of small mercies, and Otto's gifts were accepted provided they contained nothing that could be used for self-destruction or escape. During conversations with various acquaintances, Otto expressed beliefs that Martha had not fully comprehended the gravity of evidence arrayed against her during the trial. He suggested that with different legal representation or a more vigorous defense, questions about her mental capacity might have been raised before the jury. This line of thinking represented either genuine concern about a miscarriage of justice or perhaps Otto's psychological mechanism for reconciling his continued attachment to a convicted murderer with the horrifying reality of her crimes. Others who had known Martha during earlier periods of her life began coming forward with recollections of behavior they now viewed as potentially significant. These individuals described incidents of prolonged silence where Martha seemed mentally absent, complaints of severe headaches that left her incapacitated, and episodes where she appeared confused about her surroundings or unable to process information being communicated to her. At the time these incidents had occurred, observers had attributed them to stress, fatigue, or temporary illness rather than fundamental mental instability. The emergence of these accounts prompted some within the community to question whether Martha had been mentally competent during the years when the poisonings occurred. The legal system of the era recognized insanity as a potential defense to criminal charges, but establishing insanity required demonstrating that the defendant had not understood the nature of their actions or could not distinguish right from wrong at the time crimes were committed. The question of Martha's mental state had not been raised during trial, leaving it as a potential ground for post-conviction appeals. Several acquaintances of the Juncan family drafted letters to authorities arguing that Martha's mental condition warranted formal examination before the death sentence was carried out. These correspondents were careful to state that they did not seek to excuse the acts proven at trial or to cast doubt upon the jury's verdict regarding guilt. Rather, they contended that justice required certainty about Martha's mental capacity before executing her, as putting to death someone who had not been mentally responsible for their actions would constitute a profound moral wrong. The petitions detailed specific instances of aberrant behavior observed over the years. Writers described occasions when Martha had seemed unable to recall recent conversations, times when she had stood motionless for extended periods apparently unaware of her surroundings, and incidents where her responses to questions had been disconnected from the topics being discussed. Some correspondents suggested that the childhood abuse Martha had endured might have produced lasting psychological damage that impaired her judgment and self-control. The authorities who reviewed these petitions faced a difficult decision. Granting clemency or ordering psychiatric examination after conviction would set a precedent that could be invoked in future cases, potentially undermining the finality of jury verdicts. Yet executing someone who might have been insane during commission of their crimes raised serious ethical and legal concerns. The reviewing officials needed to determine whether the petitions contained sufficient substance to warrant intervention or whether they represented misguided sympathy for a rightfully convicted murderer. After examining the submitted materials and considering the arguments presented, the authorities reached their conclusion. They determined that the evidence of mental incapacity was insufficient to overcome the verdict reached by a properly constituted jury after hearing extensive testimony. The petitions described behavior that might indicate eccentricity, stress, or temporary confusion but did not establish the profound mental derangement necessary to meet the legal standard for insanity. The reviewing officials noted that Martha had functioned adequately in various domestic positions, had managed household finances including insurance matters, had commissioned and overseen construction of an elaborate grave monument, and had conducted herself appropriately during the trial itself. These actions demonstrated capacity for planning, financial management, and social interaction inconsistent with the severe mental impairment that would be required to set aside a murder conviction. Furthermore, the systematic nature of the poisonings argued against impulsive actions driven by uncontrolled mental illness. The pattern revealed calculated planning, obtaining poison under plausible pretense, administering it in ways designed to avoid immediate suspicion, collecting insurance payments following deaths, and continuing the pattern across multiple victims over nearly a decade. Such sustained deception and planning suggested cognitive functioning sufficient for criminal responsibility, regardless of whatever psychological peculiarities Martha might have displayed in other contexts. The officials acknowledged that Martha's childhood had been difficult and that early trauma might have influenced her psychological development. However, tragic backgrounds did not automatically excuse criminal behavior, as such a principle would undermine the entire foundation of criminal justice. Many individuals endured comparable or worse childhood circumstances without resorting to murder, and the law could not create different standards of responsibility based on the relative difficulty of defendants' early lives. The reviewing authorities concluded that no special circumstances existed that would justify interfering with the jury's verdict or the sentence properly imposed by the court. They found that Martha had been of sound enough mind to understand the nature of her actions, to distinguish right from wrong, and to engage in sustained deception designed to avoid detection. The petitions were formally denied, and the sentence of death would proceed as originally pronounced. With the final avenue of appeal exhausted, preparations began for carrying out the execution. The date was set for the 22nd of October in 1894, giving Martha approximately 3 weeks from the denial of the petitions to the scheduled execution. During this period, she remained in a cell designed specifically for condemned prisoners, where guards maintained continuous observation to prevent suicide. The prison chaplain visited regularly, offering spiritual counsel to a woman who would soon face whatever judgment awaited beyond death. The condemned cell existed in a state of suspended reality, cut off from normal prison routine and from the world beyond the walls. Time passed in strange fashion for those awaiting execution, each day bringing the final moment closer while simultaneously stretching into endless hours of isolated reflection. Martha had no meaningful activities to occupy her time, no work assignments or regular interactions with other prisoners. She existed in limbo, alive but already partially severed from the living world. Prison records from this period reveal little about Martha's emotional state or her reflections on the crimes for which she had been condemned. Condemned prisoners were not typically encouraged to provide confessions or detailed accounts of their crimes, as such statements could complicate legal matters if last-minute appeals materialized. Whether Martha experienced remorse, maintained her innocence, or simply withdrew into herself remains largely unknown, as no detailed account of her final weeks appears to have been preserved or made public. The mechanics of execution required careful preparation to ensure the procedure would be carried out efficiently and with minimal suffering. The hangman examined the prisoner to estimate her weight and physical condition, calculations necessary for determining the proper length of rope that would ensure death occurred through neck fracture rather than slow strangulation. Prison officials inspected the gallows apparatus to verify that all mechanical components functioned properly and that the drop would fall smoothly when activated. On the morning of the 22nd of October, Martha was awakened earlier than usual and informed that the time had come. She was permitted to wash and dress in clean clothing provided for the occasion. The chaplain arrived to accompany her on the short walk from her cell to the execution chamber. Offering prayers and whatever spiritual comfort could be provided during those final moments of life. The procession moved through corridors emptied of other prisoners, who had been secured in their cells to prevent any disruption during the execution. Guards flanked Martha on either side, not restraining her but positioned to intervene should she attempt to resist or collapse. The walk covered only a short distance physically, but for the condemned woman, each step carried her irreversibly toward the termination of her existence. The gallows stood in a chamber specifically designed for executions, positioned where the act would remain hidden from public view while allowing the small number of official witnesses required by law to observe that the sentence had been properly carried out. Prison officials, the executioner, and several other authorized personnel waited as Martha entered the room and was positioned on the trapdoor that would soon fall away beneath her feet. The executioner worked quickly to complete the necessary preparations. A white hood was placed over Martha's head, blocking her vision and sparing witnesses from having to see her face during the final moments. The noose was positioned around her neck with professional efficiency, the knot placed at the precise angle calculated to produce instant death when the drop occurred. Restraints were secured around her legs to prevent violent movement that might complicate the execution or disturb witnesses. When all preparations were complete, a signal was given. The executioner pulled the lever that released the trapdoor mechanism. Martha fell through the opening, the rope snapping taut with the sudden weight. Death came swiftly, the calculated drop producing the cervical fracture that terminated life within seconds or at most a few minutes. Her body hung motionless as officials waited the prescribed interval before confirming that all vital signs had ceased. A prison doctor examined the body and formally certified that death had occurred, completing the legal requirements for execution. The body was then cut down and removed from the gallows chamber to be prepared for burial. In accordance with the sentence pronounced at trial and the standard practice for executed criminals, Martha's remains would not be released to family members but would instead be interred within the prison grounds where executed prisoners were customarily laid to rest. The burial occurred later that same day in an unmarked section of the prison grounds reserved for this purpose. No ceremony accompanied the interment beyond whatever brief words the chaplain might have spoken over the grave. No headstone would mark the location, no monument would commemorate the deceased. The execution and burial of Martha Needle had been completed with bureaucratic efficiency, transforming a living woman into an entry in official records and a body beneath unnamed soil. News of the execution spread quickly through Melbourne and beyond. Newspapers that had covered the trial extensively now reported the carrying out of the sentence, providing details about the execution while speculating about the motivations that had driven Martha to commit such extensive crimes. Editorial writers reflected on the case's broader implications for society, criminal justice, and understanding of human nature. The crimes challenged prevailing assumptions about women's inherent nurturing instincts and raised troubling questions about how many similar cases might have gone undetected in an era when forensic capabilities remained limited. The insurance companies that had paid claims following the deaths of Henry and the 3 children found themselves in an uncomfortable position. They had issued policies in good faith and paid benefits upon receiving properly certified death certificates, standard practice that raised no suspicions at the time. The revelation that those deaths had resulted from deliberate poisoning rather than natural causes raised complex legal questions about whether the payments had been obtained through fraud and whether the companies could seek recovery. However, the money had long since been spent, primarily on the elaborate grave monument that Martha had commissioned. Even if legal grounds existed for demanding repayment, no assets remained from which recovery could be obtained. The executed woman had left no estate, no property, no funds that could be seized to satisfy such claims. The insurance companies ultimately absorbed the losses as an unfortunate cost of doing business in an era before more sophisticated investigative procedures could detect such fraud. The grave monument that Martha had constructed became an object of morbid curiosity. Visitors to the cemetery where Henry and the 3 daughters had initially been buried would seek out the elaborate memorial, pointing it out to companions and recounting the horrifying story it represented. The structure stood as a strange testament to maternal devotion expressed through poison and paid for with insurance money obtained through murder. Eventually, the grave would be removed or relocated as the cemetery underwent changes, but for years it served as a physical reminder of the case. Otto Juncken struggled to resume normal life following the execution of the woman he had intended to marry. The double trauma of losing his brother to murder and discovering that his fiancée was responsible created psychological wounds that could not easily heal. He continued in the saddlery trade but found interactions with others difficult, as acquaintances inevitably wanted to discuss the case and his connection to it. Some viewed him with sympathy as an innocent victim of Martha's deceptions, while others questioned why he had not recognized warning signs that seemed obvious in retrospect. Herman Juncan likewise carried lasting effects from his near-death experience. The knowledge that someone he had trusted had deliberately attempted to poison him multiple times created a profound sense of betrayal that extended beyond Martha herself. He found himself unable to eat meals prepared by others without experiencing anxiety, a psychological response to trauma that would persist for years. The physical symptoms of arsenic poisoning eventually resolved, but the psychological scars proved more resistant to healing. The case attracted attention from medical and legal professionals interested in understanding both the forensic aspects and the psychological dimensions of such crimes. Doctors analyzed the symptoms reported by witnesses and the autopsy findings to better understand arsenic poisoning's clinical presentation, hoping to improve detection of similar cases in the future. Legal scholars examined the procedural aspects of the trial and the sufficiency of circumstantial evidence to support capital convictions, debates that would continue long after Martha's execution. Criminologists attempted to develop profiles or explanations for why someone might commit such crimes. The systematic poisoning of family members for insurance money represented a relatively rare form of murder that challenged simple explanations. Was Martha driven purely by greed, seeing her family as obstacles to financial gain? Did she harbor deeper resentments or hatreds concealed beneath a facade of domestic normalcy? Had childhood trauma warped her psychological development in ways that made murder seem rational or acceptable? These questions attracted various theories but no definitive answers, as Martha had gone to her grave without providing any explanation for her actions. The prison maintained certain items connected to Martha's case as part of its official records. Most notably, authorities created a death mask following the execution, a plaster cast taken from her face that preserved her features for posterity. This practice, common in the 19th century, reflected both scientific interest in criminal anthropology and a more morbid fascination with capturing the physical characteristics of notorious criminals. The mask would eventually be displayed alongside other artifacts from significant criminal cases, becoming part of the institutional memory preserved by the prison system. The broader community struggled to comprehend how such extensive crimes could have occurred undetected for so many years. The succession of deaths within Martha's household had happened in plain view of neighbors, friends, and even medical professionals, yet no one had recognized the pattern or questioned whether natural causes alone could explain such concentrated tragedy. This collective failure of observation raised uncomfortable questions about social dynamics and the assumptions that allowed murderers to operate with impunity. Women in particular occupied a position of implicit trust within domestic spheres during this era. Society assumed that mothers and wives naturally cared for their families with selfless devotion, that female nature itself predisposed women toward nurturing rather than harming those dependent upon them. This assumption created a kind of invisibility for women who violated these expectations, as observers found it psychologically difficult to suspect maternal murder even when evidence might otherwise have prompted investigation. The medical profession also faced criticism in the wake of Martha's conviction. Multiple doctors had attended family members during their final illnesses, yet none had recognized arsenic poisoning despite symptoms that, in retrospect, clearly indicated such poisoning. The failure stemmed partly from limited diagnostic capabilities but also from doctors' own assumptions about domestic situations. Physicians treating poor families expected to encounter unexplained illnesses and deaths given the harsh living conditions, inadequate nutrition, and sanitation problems common in working-class neighborhoods. The case prompted some reforms in how insurance companies evaluated claims, though changes came gradually rather than immediately. Companies began requiring more detailed medical information before paying death benefits, particularly in cases involving multiple policies or successive deaths within single families. These measures aimed to identify suspicious patterns before paying out money that might reward criminal behavior, though implementing such screening remained challenging given the volume of legitimate claims processed. Forensic science received a significant boost from cases like Martha's that demonstrated the value of chemical analysis in criminal investigations. The ability to detect poisons in exhumed bodies and seized evidence provided prosecutors with objective proof that could overcome the limitations of circumstantial evidence and witness testimony. As analytical techniques improved over subsequent decades, poisoning became progressively more difficult to commit without detection, fundamentally altering the risk calculations for would-be poisoners. The story also highlighted the particular vulnerability of children in an era when society provided minimal protections for minors suffering abuse or neglect. Martha's own childhood experiences of violence and exploitation had occurred without intervention from authorities or community members who might have witnessed the abuse. The cycle connecting her victimization as a child to her later crimes as an adult suggested broader failures in social systems that allowed dysfunction to perpetuate across generations. Historians and true crime enthusiasts would continue examining Martha's case for more than a century following her execution. Each generation brought new interpretative frameworks to understanding her motivations and actions. Early accounts emphasized moral depravity and inherent criminality. Later analyses incorporated psychological theories about trauma, personality disorders, and the effects of childhood abuse. Feminist scholars debated whether Martha's crimes represented an extreme form of agency in a society that offered women few legitimate paths to power or independence. The three Juncan brothers who had become entangled in Martha's web of deception never fully escaped the shadow of these events. Otto's continued attachment to Martha even after her conviction suggested psychological complexities that friends and family struggled to understand. Some interpreted his loyalty as evidence of manipulation so profound that it persisted despite overwhelming proof of her guilt. Others saw it as Otto's inability to reconcile two contradictory images, the woman he had loved and intended to marry versus the cold-blooded killer revealed at trial. The Melbourne jail where Martha was executed and buried continued operating for many decades, accumulating additional condemned prisoners who would follow her path from cell to gallows to unmarked grave. The institution eventually became a historical site, preserved as a reminder of the harsh justice system that had prevailed during colonial and early Commonwealth periods. Tours guides would recount Martha's story among other notable cases, describing the systematic poisonings and the swift execution that had concluded her crimes. The archive of trial transcripts, police reports, autopsy findings, and other documents related to the case provided researchers with unusually complete documentation of a 19th-century murder investigation. The survival of these records allowed later generations to examine the case in detail impossible for most historical crimes where evidence had been lost or destroyed. Scholars could read actual testimony, review forensic reports, and trace the investigation's development from initial suspicions through conviction and execution. Questions about Martha's true motivations remained perpetually unresolved. Did she kill primarily for money, viewing insurance payments as rewards for eliminating family members she experienced as burdens? Did jealousy or resentment toward her husband and Otto's brothers drive the murders, with financial gain serving merely as a convenient rationalization? Had psychological damage from childhood trauma created a person fundamentally incapable of normal emotional bonds, who viewed even her own children as obstacles rather than beloved dependents? Without a confession or detailed psychological evaluation, these questions could generate theories but never definitive answers. The elaborate grave monument that had consumed so much of the insurance money presented its own interpretive puzzle. Did Martha construct it as a genuine expression of grief and loss, suggesting she experienced some form of remorse or conflicted feelings about her victims? Or did it represent performance, a calculated display designed to deflect suspicion by demonstrating appropriate mourning behavior? The expenditure suggested either authentic investment in memorializing her family or remarkable dedication to maintaining appearances even after their deaths.